Now that our modeling paste layer is dry, all this texture, we're going to do our paint layers. And I'm just using some cheap acrylic paints that you buy at the craft store. This is a Folk Art brand. There's a lot of other brands where you can use whatever acrylic paint you have on hand. I like to get a little dish or a paper plate or something to put the paint on, because for this I like to use my finger to paint the different layers on, because I can feel the texture and I can feel whether or not I'm painting too hard, because I don't want to fill all these great areas and creases of texture with paint, because then they're not going to be visible as much. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get a little bit on the tip of our finger by kind of dragging it through the paint. So there's just a very thin layer of paint on your finger, because you don't want a big blob, because then it's really going to soak into all those cracks. So I'm just going to get a little bit of paint and very lightly going to rub the paint over this texture. A little bit of paint, and I'm going to lightly rub this over the top of this texture. You can see the texture really picks up this paint. He's really going to lightly rub it across the top of all of this texture. Now you can see how it's picked up all the texture from the modeling compound, and you can see here how it's picked up the texture from the tape right here along these edges, and the tape is kind of showing through. So you don't want to get your paint all the way down into those cracks. You're going to let those different layers show through. You're just going to keep doing this, keep adding your paint until you're happy with how it looks. Little circular motions. And make sure you get your sides as well. When I'm doing my birds or houses, I like to do a blue upper layer for the sky, and sometimes I'll do a little bit of green down at the bottom just to give you that earth and sky. Sometimes I do brown at the bottom. Sometimes I just leave it white or make little patches here and there. Now if you get done and you're seeing more areas that are not filled in, you can always go back over with more paint. Press a little harder if you want a little bit more paint on it. Now you can see how that's really starting to kind of pick up and emphasize all that texture that you've done with the tape. And then you can see the swirl motion. You drag your finger through the modeling compound so you can get different effects with that. I'm going to go in with a little bit different, a little darker color. Add a little bit of shading. get a little bit more texture, depth of color and texture. If you get to doing this and you decide that you've made an area too dark, you can go over that area with white paint. And it'll help lighten it up a little bit. Go back with your lighter colors of paint, lighten it up if you want. Now at this point, I would let this dry thoroughly before you put your white paint on. I've got the first layer of paint. I'm going to let it dry completely, and then I'm going to go back with white paint and just lightly touch the tops of the texture just to kind of really emphasize them and bring them out. And your bottom layer has to be completely dry, otherwise it just kind of mixes it together and makes a very all one color type of a background. And you really want the layered upon layered colors of paint on there to really bring out that texture, and it really gives the piece a lot of depth and makes it very interesting to look at. So let your first layer of paint dry, and then we'll go on to the next step. So now that this is dried, I'm going to go back with some white paint, and I'm going to highlight all these top edges, give this a little bit more depth. I'm just going to lay this paint on the very top tips of this texture. I don't want to push even as hard as we did with the first paint layer. This is very, very lightly touching just the highest points of the texture. And this is going to give this a lot of depth. I've zoomed in a little bit so you can see better when you go over it with this white. Now you can see how that really kind of makes a very nice layered look, and this will stand out even more when we get farther along in the process. We're just going to continue doing our highlights with our white, laying that paint down. This is a very forgiving technique. If you feel like you've put too much white on, you can go back with your first paint layer after this is dried. Always let your different colored paint layers dry in between. Otherwise they will just mix together and you'll end up with all one color. All one shade. And that makes it not quite as interesting. Keep dipping your finger in and working it over the area until you're satisfied with how it looks. I like to really get my edges covered good with paint, make them a little bit more stand out than the centers. Kind of gives it a good frame for your art piece when you're done with everything. Since I'm going to be doing a bird on this one, I'm trying to lighten it up some. Really get those edges lightened up. I want it to have kind of an airy feel to it. I still want the feeling of the sky, a very textured sky. So in that first layer you want to get those darker areas for your shading. Even if you don't want your sky to be that dark or that blue, you want those underlayers to show through of your texture so that you have that nice depth in your piece. Now then, so far we put down our tape layer, then we put down our modeling paste and let that dry. Put down our first paint layer, and this is our second paint layer. We're going to let these dry thoroughly, and then we're going to move on to the aging to make your piece look aged, and then we'll move on to making the bird and the other elements.